Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Conti. I have been an independent contractor and consultant for over a decade, originally starting in aeronautical design to international development to uh, the military to much more. And so over the years, CI/CD has become more prominent as the industry has evolved and has become more mature. Um, Kind of walking down a history lane of what CI/CD originally was back when webmasters were more prominent. It was a continuous improvement, continuous development process where webmasters were trained every 6 months to a year. They need to update their systems for security reasons and making sure everything is relevant and up to date. So over the years now, it's become fully automated. Usually, I like to approach things from like a level 1 to level 2 to level 3 CI/CD approach. But for product design, I definitely want to get into what continuous research and continuous development is for a product designer. So, research operations, research ops, for me, that I have found to be a nice Goldilocks zone for research, primary and secondary, is breaking them down into three different buckets. Each one can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Typically, users usually are the primary effect towards the implementation, utility, and usability of findings and implementation of solutions. So user research, which is more common these days, journey mapping, getting into personas, doing surveys, doing empirical or ethnographic research. It's a very common environment to uh, gain IAO variables or interest, attitudes, and opinions. And then operations research is getting into the operational considerations. So I break that down into coulds, shoulds, uh, wants, and needs. So based off of user input, uh, secondarily, I will look into from a policy perspective, a legal perspective, a doctrine perspective. Is this something from a user perspective we can actually implement? Would it actually hurt our users, even though it might make it more effective for them or useful? Is there any bylaws or any legalese that we need to be considerate to? And then the market research elements, market trends and considerations of how even the updates to the system, application, software, anything in between, is impacting the market, or the market is influencing us within our solutioning. So it's not really just, one size fits all of user input, but I think it's a triangulation of wants and needs, consequences, and risks. So from a research operations perspective, especially when we know society constantly evolves asymmetric or asynchronous to how we implement. From a human-centric perspective, we are not going at the same pace as society is. So there's always trade-offs and considerations, primary, secondary, or third ranking consequences that take place based off of implementation and what that looks like within the roadmap and how you plan for it. But the great part of implementing research operations and continuous research into the process is really taking into account that no matter what, the ground that we are on is always shifting, evolving, adapting, and adopting to us, or vice versa. If you think of like ontological design, we shape the world and then the world shapes us back, right? So as we influence the world influences us in return. It's like MC Escher's hand for any artists out there. It's the hand that's drawing the hand, which is then drawing the hand. And then getting into the design operations of things, I like to break it down into three buckets as well. Single factor ideation or development, which is a one-to-one relationship. When you're thinking of single slice, segmented designs or implementation within the process to where it's not really touching on many different or impacting many different pieces to the puzzle. I genuinely think of that as a single factor design or ideation development thinking that you're taking into account. The next is multi-factor ideation. one-to-many relationship, meaning that it isn't involving all things, but it's involving things that are in the closest center of gravity towards that design process to troubleshoot, to problem solve, to think through, to chew on, to validate. Through all of this, you're dealing with a divergence and convergence of effects. And then full factor ideation, one to all relationships. How does this from a 360 view impact everything around us? Usually, when you get into a wider scale of relationships, you're dealing with specificity and sensitivity, usually because it's either very revolutionary, it's innovative, it's disruptive, it requires a lot of change. So think of single all the way to full factor. As you go from single to multi to full, it gets more complex, but also can become more risky, or you have to take in the challenges, the compliance and consequences to those things. And again, it's not one size fits all. When you're designing to something, you don't do it in broad strokes. Even when you're implementing a vision, the vision can also be distilled down into vertical and horizontal design and prototyping. Design thinking as a whole, I came from the background of design theory, right? You can't design think if you don't know what design is. So my foundations are in design theory, not design thinking, because then it helps me understand how you think about design. So instead of just bucketing into one like design thinking umbrella, as you, and I'm sure many people have gone through the design iterations and chewing on ideas, going back and forth with developers and things like that, is there's a push and pull, almost like a concentric circle and overlapping like Venn diagram of different types of how you think within that design process, whether it's design critique, design criticism, pluralistic walkthroughs, design workshopping, design studio. It's not predicated on just one element over any. They're all important. Some might consider visual design a subcategory of communication design, but it's all based off of the organizational structure and what makes the most sense to your workflow and process, which is all valuable and very useful, but each one has its own pockets of very robust and nuanced considerations and even philosophical nuances. So, from that design thinking practice, as we evolve and as applications have matured and maturated, or we put out a release, 6 months later, 3 months later, okay, now that we've gotten to this point, where are we now? How do we think about users now? Did we meet our mark? Because of certain limitations, because of our infrastructure, let's get user research going again, or operational research or market research, and think about how can we further synthesize this for the sake of our users and putting them first. So these different pockets of design thinking are ubiquitous within the whole entire continuous development process, and even within a CI/CD practice. The next one is systems thinking. I usually don't apply just design thinking. I think in systems theory. Again, I come from a systems theory perspective. What is a system or systems? In order for me to think about it, systematically. So you have information systems, decision support systems, branding systems. Sometimes they're design systems, right? Management systems thinking, workflow, product service systems. Some of these may overlap, but it's to show you that it's not one size fits all, and it can be very nuanced, right? If you use specific types of components libraries, or ones that are not fully refined, while some components are more detailed, and more thorough. Are they one-offs? Are they repeated patterns? How are you taking those user interface conventions and supporting it systematically? And how does that product versus service correlate? And how those workflows all come to be is very important. I know that if you're applying like Conway's law, right? We create a system or an application that reflects the organizational psychology of our day-to-day, right? And when you think of models, right, and you're getting into like human model interaction, or model-based engineering or model-based decision-making, kind of what you were showing with the user journey flows, right? Those are mental models for people to act upon systematically, but it's not necessarily predicated on just a blanket system. It's pertaining to specific nuances of how that user journey is to operate systematically in a holistic perspective, divergently or convergently, for that matter. So this is to give you a more broken down uh, distillation of that. Don't limit yourself to what you've already done, and think about scale and scope. How can you build out more, but also how can you build out pockets of unique and uh, novel ideas as you're building the further foundation and activity centered considerations through the process. The holistic immersion elements between the research ops and design ops practice, we don't bring this into the full gamut of what divergent and convergent thinking really pertains to, whether using single diamond or double diamond design thinking, right? When you're bringing in things, whether it's research based, whether it's design based, whether it's development based, whether it's management based, is when you start blending that stuff together, pushing and pulling, having the conversations, having the tough messages being relayed. Is it being communicated effectively? Are we getting past the finish line? Do we have all the needs that are uh, there for us to execute in the way we'd like to? Is when you bring that stuff together, is you're getting into lateral thinking and futures thinking, right? So laterally thinking means you're getting creative, right? You're getting creative about how you're implementing things and in what kind of way. Like what makes sense, what doesn't. What is the intention? What is the purpose? What deadlines do you have to meet? What does the user now feel now that that's what we've implemented? How can we creatively still solve their problem, even though that we've already delivered it? Now we have a release in 3 to 6 months. What can we do now? And then, and along the same line is futures thinking. Okay, this is where we are right now. We've implemented everything from a user perspective to a T, operationally market related. It's going to help us better position ourselves competitively, but also meet user interests. What can we do now with users involved, stakeholders involved, and people involved, and deliver something into the future beyond where we are now? So it's getting more imaginative, thinking of like blue sky, green pastures. How can we now take all of these dynamics in the process? Some of that gets into experimentation. We get into like DOE, right? Design of experimentation. Um, and some of that deals with, a discriminant reliability where you don't have all the data points you need, where you might think of it as envisioning what it may look like, even though you don't have the necessary data points to make it valid. You have inter-rater reliability, where you have some exposure to what could be reliable, but not. You don't have complete validation on all considerations, but let's say you're 50% there, or 60-40, or 70-30, or 20-80. You have some semblance of validation and reliability to that. And then you have complete internal reliability, even within futures thinking, to where we know where we can take this down the road. We know the users love it because even though this might be a new implementation, we've been following the empirical research or ethnographic research for the past 8 months and know that this could be exactly what we need, right? Or, even getting into the A/B testing, right? And gathering secondary research, getting into pair testing, getting into, split testing, and doing all of these different uh, ways to measure effectiveness qualitatively and quantitatively. So, as CI/CD has come to full fruition and it's more automated now, even though CI/CD has been practiced for several years, is that Now, as product designers, now that we have these automated systems, the next step is, okay, we got to make sure that we're continuously developing our designs to evolve to our user ecosystems and our communities, because they're moving at a different pace than we are. They have different affordances, they have different sentiments towards our application, you know, 6 months down the road, you know, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, right? And, they say like you can easily underestimate what you can do in a year, but then you can completely overestimate what you can do in 10, right? So as you are, implementing and automating and building out all of these things from a engineering perspective, development perspective, the product designer's responsibility now is to evolve that product. Sometimes it's leaning out things if it's too costly, and making sure that we're downscaling in appropriate areas because it's not as effective. You don't just lean out, within process, but you can also lean out within your application, product, or service as well. But that's the necessary trade-offs towards making sure that you always meet operational user and business interests, but more so importantly, you're staying modern. You're staying as a zeitgeist to the industry. So the benefits overall, like I was kind of discussing a little bit, is having a continuous research and development process, using ResearchOps and DesignOps as the segue towards the necessary conversations between product management, design, and development, because it's never over. The CI/CD pipelines now afford you the opportunity, more so than ever before, to consistently look into user interests primarily, but also think about the operational benefit of making sure you're always meeting market and user needs. And then the acculturation, advancement of a more human-centered design. There's certain designs out there's certain websites out there, certain applications that are 5 to 8 years old that are just not doing their job as much as they used to, and yet they're not really trying to change. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel. They're not trying to address more common user interests or demands from telling what the market says. And so it can't be human-centered design if it's not human-centric anymore, because the dynamics of the landscape of the community, as society, as technology, as the ecosystems around us all are moving at a different pace. You can easily fall into something that was once human-centric to something that no longer makes sense. And so that's what CI/CD has afforded us as product designers, is always looking into how can we do this better, and where can we think abundantly and with a growth mentality within our services currently. But also the further proliferation of human-centered computing. This is more common now than it was in the past, but getting into HCC and taking into account how developer experience is just as important too as the user experience and design, right? And human-centered computing is bringing in the information systems management, the business science, the industrial and organizational psychology in with computation, and building out the necessary model-based decision making that's necessary for human model interaction. And model essentially means overall, like let's say you're using Agile, DevOps, let's say you're applying Six Sigma or some other practice, right? Is human model interaction is users and society as a whole interacting with you as an organizational structure, to say the least. But also that is so deeply rooted into your day-to-day that your updates all the way down to how your process is directly correlated and impacted by user needs and interests and wants. So what that does is it furthers new and innovative ways to discover and execute novel, nimble, or noble ideas. to where you're not so rigid on, okay, well, you know, we can only do it this way, or we've already done it. Okay, it's a one-off. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Thankfully, the CI/CD pipelines have now given us the opportunity for us to always think forward and to fail forward and to experiment and get into purposeful play like you need to, because that's really what it's there for. You don't need a CI/CD pipeline if it just stays the same, right? So that's what it's given us as product designers, and to be able to see us as an ongoing process within the design ideations, the development considerations, how we manage and strategize. It's completely changed the design strategy overall in the fact that you're not going from a waterfall perspective, but as it was shown with the diagram with the UX/DX uh, life cycle, that it's constantly going in perpetuity and is like a living process that never ends. And that's how you think. If you're applying like game theory, it's an infinite game, right? You don't think just, okay, now it's here and that's it. There's great disruption. There's a lot of sustainable innovation, whether it's recombinant or endogenous, that can take place within that. And you can contact me on LinkedIn at Artist Conti, and thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matthew. Really kind of almost a technical view of how to incorporate design into a CI/CD pipeline. So, and it used a lot of graphics, which is kind of touching on the last conversation as well.
Thank you so much.
Great. So just to remind everybody out there, if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them on whichever channel that you're watching this on, and I'll put them through to Matthew. The first question I had, and it's a term I've never come across before, but the multi-factor and full factor ideation. Can you give me some examples of those to kind of make it a bit more tangible? What are the differences in your mind between those three different elements?
Yeah, let's say you have a use case, right, where you have to submit a form, right? And you put all of your information in there: first name, last name, email. Like you're setting up, let's say, a profile, or you're setting up an account, right? First name, last name, and creating a username and password, right? You submit that, right? But then it creates your profile. That's one factor. That's like a single factor, right? But then let's say it shoots out an email saying, okay, now that you've got this, we need to get a confirmation email saying that this is the correct email. We got that. Okay, now that we have that, we now have to put in like, let's say we have to now set up like multi-factor authentication. Now that that's happened, or you have the option to enroll in it when you sit there and confirm your email. So like, even though you're just creating essentially your credentials, it then can lead into these different factors that you're taking into account, right? And let's say when they submit the confirmation email to you, you select confirm email. Let's say then it auto populates what you see in society, where all of a sudden you're signing up for subscriptions to their email list, right? So then you're taking all of those different considerations just from one instance of just creating someone's profile or login credentials, right? Full factor is getting into like, we can use the same instance, right? But then once they have all of those credentials, they have MFA, then you're getting into like single sign-on, right? So where all of a sudden you can now have access to like 5 different applications, like Okta or something, like some type of tool that allows you to sign into multiple different applications. And then those credentials branch out into all of the different applications as well. And then what those do is you have to set up, let's say, different types of validation for those as well. So it's all a level of magnitude, right? and how that impacts the greater scale, like the splash, like I call it. Like if you're creating something that completely revolutionizes a ticketing system in an application, the more advanced or more complex it is, even though it might not look very complex. I've worked with designers and researchers in the past to where it might not look like a complicated implementation, or it looks very like cutting edge, but then you realize the ripple effect it has across multiple different areas of your system or system of systems or a product of products, right? Especially if you're getting into these architectures that you have a one to many or many to many relationship. And so it's never just like you design just for design's sake, which is great. You should, but you also have to think about the associated risks. But hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I love the oh, just give me an account feature, because that's a brilliant one of, like, as you said, okay, so now we need to validate your email. But wait a sec, what happens if somebody's trying to use the system and they haven't validated their email? Like, how does that account that's partially validated, like, how does that work? And what about if they forget their password? And what if they, like, so it just keeps rippling on from what seems like potentially a simple request.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what you know what you don't know, but then you don't know what you don't know. And it's kind of like it's a triangulation of the three. It's like, okay, now that we've done this, from a primary perspective, now secondarily from a research perspective or primary or secondary design ops perspective, like now that we've done that, how do we validate to make sure we're covering all user needs, right? Like if someone says, I wish, when I create my sign-on credentials, I just want to make it easy. Like I'm sure people have heard that response. What does easy mean, right? To communication, everything's communicated but not necessarily comprehended, right? Is that just make it easy, but what does that mean? Oh well, send out the email, like make it simple, like we don't have to go searching for anything in particular. So we the cost and benefit to that is never one size fits all, unfortunately, but it's also that you, you know sometimes the novelty is challenging assumptions too. Like let's say we do that just knowingly, are we missing any good ideas you know in the process?
Yeah. No, it's a great kind of run through. I have another question. We might just have a little bit of time.
Okay.
One of the things that I was kind of watching is all of those different steps. Do you have a process or any kind of techniques for workshopping ideation or for doing these steps that make sure that you're touching on all of those different elements?
Yeah, I always like to advocate, and this can be, hopefully it's taken in jest, it makes a lot of sense. Is the human centered elements, human centric design or human centric computing. Sometimes the process also needs to be human centric, right? Um, and so there's been instances where I'm having to create a process specifically based off of those needs. But for me, I do have like toolkits. I have frameworks that I use. I have research templates that I've created myself. But no, business, no organization, no entity should ever feel like there's one way of doing it. And I would say that they should create toolkits or processes that are defined by their models, and the way that their ecosystem structured, because not everyone might use what they need to the way that others want to. Um, so I would just have to say that don't feel limited to one way of doing something, as long as that you're solving the end goal, because usually from a design perspective we're out to solve problems, we're not out to necessarily like that at least when I grew up and I got my degree in fine arts, right? Is there's a process that I studied called process art, where it wasn't about the final outcome all the time, even though it's very important. The process itself was a form of artistic expression, right? So take that as an opportunity for you to create a CRCD process for CI/CD for product design in a way that makes sense for your organization and the way that your organization is structured.
Great. I love that analogy. So that actually brings us to time. So thank you very much, Matthew, for sharing.
Thank you so much.